Well, good morning, everybody, and afternoon for those of you on the East Coast and Central Time. My name is Jake Milstein, and welcome to our panel discussion today. We're going to be talking about the LastPass and Okta breaches. As it is January 5th, wanted to also say hello to everybody and Happy New Year. I see many of the folks here are repeat viewers of our webinars and panels. And so for those of you who are returning, I want to say welcome back and Happy New Year. And for those of you who are new, well, also Happy New Year and welcome. As you can see on the right-hand side of the screen, there's a chat. Feel free to let us know where you're joining from. Also, if the chat is going bloop, 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 there's a little bell on the top and you can mute the chat. Additionally, there's always a question that comes up. Are we going to get a recording of this? Yes. Anybody who registered, the system sends you a recording. It is a system. And so if it fails or if it goes to your junk or something and you want a link to it, you can go ahead and email us. My email address is jake@criticalinsight.com, which I'll put in the chat later when I'm not talking, and you can shoot me an email and I'll send it over to you. So as we get started today, we have an hour here. And I want to be really clear about a couple of things. Number one is, we're not dumping on any specific company here. If we know anything, it's that breaches happen. The bad guys are really good at what they do. And we're not here to dump on Okta or LastPass. The fact is that both of them had breaches. Those breaches might affect you, probably do in some way, or you're just here to be curious. And so what we're here to do is talk about the unknowns. And talk about the potential risks, because as I look at the folks who are here, a lot of IT directors, CIOs, CISOs, IT managers, and what you need to know are the risks so that you can make the right decisions for your org. And so what we're going to do today is give you the information that you need so you can make the right decisions for your org. And if you have questions as we go, please put them in the chat. One of my favorite things to do is to interrupt the panelists so that we can get your questions answered. One of the things we also want to do is there will be more breaches this year. Look, every vendor you have is at risk. That is just the world we live in. And so we want to make sure that you are prepared for any of your vendors or, well, for your organization directly to have a breach. And that's one of the really important things that we want to get across today. As we get into some of this stuff, we want to be clear we are not cryptographic experts. We're security and risk experts. And so if somebody has deep cryptographic questions or somebody has expertise, awesome, put it in the chat. But that's not us. And what we're going to do as we go through this is we're going to start with Okta, because I know most people are here to talk about LastPass, and we want to give that more time toward the end here as we get going. So who are we? Critical Insight, cybersecurity company based in Seattle. We provide cybersecurity as a service, helping organizations prepare for an attack, detect an attack quickly through our security operations center, and respond rapidly when one happens. Panelists today, Mike Hamilton, Critical Insight founder and he's our CISO, former CISO of the city of Seattle, founded the company with Fred Langston, who's our chief product officer and has 30 plus years of cybersecurity consulting in healthcare and other verticals. Mike Simon is our chief technology officer and has the technical knowledge that we need for today's discussion. And I'm the event host. My name is Jake Milstein. Okay, so we're going to talk about what's known with each breach. We're going to talk about what's unknown. And then we're going to talk about strategies to address these risks as we go. So in December, there were two major pieces of news came out about these breaches, about LastPass and Okta, as we'll talk about in a second. The first LastPass breach was actually in August, but what happened in December is what's really concerning here. So two major attacks that have impacts that last into 2023. Sometimes you wish that what happened in 2022 just stays in 2022. Well, That's not how that works. Um, and an important thing here, attackers are using third and fourth parties to get to victims. Here it's credential management and 2FA vendors. Some of you may not have heard the term fourth party vendors. I learned it last year in doing a bunch of work with cyber insurance companies. Fourth party risk is when a vendor of a vendor has a breach, and that breach is used then to get into you or your organization. Mike Hamilton, one of the things we're seeing here is a real uptick in third party in criminals getting into third parties to breach other organizations.
Yeah, I mean, to me, this is both a response to the fact that the use of multi-factor authentication is becoming pervasive, but also to your point, if I can get to the service provider, the the managed service provider, the managed IT service provider, the whatever that services you, or in some cases a large group of local governments or something like that, and using that access, I get to them, and from them to you. That's another trend that we just see continuing, right? So a response to the fact that we're all using multi-factor authentication, so what do they have to go after? And then the technique, the tactic of going through a third party, I get to that third party by compromising multi-factor authentication through that fourth party. So we should really start just talking about nth party, and just
Yeah,
abstract this whole thing.
right. And one important part of the fourth party breaches, as the insurance companies see it, is somebody who you don't even know is one of your vendors, because one of your vendors is using them and you don't even know that they're a vendor. So that's a really important thing. And Fred, as you've seen healthcare breaches in the last year. I mean, this has become the number one way to break into to get healthcare records is through a third party breach.
And I think the irony of this is if they compromise any of these password vaults, then you're seeing the extension of that downstream to all the places that they're logging in and doing business with. So this is the concept here, is go after sources that will give you access to a whole handful, if not hundreds of other sources. So they're getting smart, right? Let's go for the place that's going to give us the most bang for the buck.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so let's jump in. We're going to, like I said, we're going to do Okta first. A couple slides on Okta, and then we're going to spend more time on LastPass, because as I've gotten notes notes from folks and stuff, people are more interested in LastPass.
Yeah.
So Mike, go ahead with Okta.
Okay, so original breach, this was actually a big thing in the news, the LastPass extortion gang, right? So they called it ransomware, and they came in through a third party, right? An affiliate of Okta they were offloading some processing to. And the result of that, while it was originally looking like a ransomware thing and it was going to be extortion, what they lifted allowed them to get to a number of corporate customers. Now, it's unclear to me is whether those corporate customers were actually compromised or if the potential was there, and I believe it's the latter. And then there was a second breach, and there was actually 4 Okta breaches in 2022. One of them is not as material, so I'm not going to go it. It's has to do with something called Authy. The second one was more of a large coordinated campaign. There were a lot of corporations affected the same way, and there's those 93 Authy users. And sorry, the other one was Auth0. And so the attackers were able to generate 2FA codes, likely based on some of the source code that they had stolen. There are other techniques that we have also seen. For example, when you get a phishing message, if you're curious and you click on the link, you just gave up your session token, and then they proxy a login request over to Microsoft to see some basic Microsoft page. They proxy that back to you. You type in the code, and all of a sudden they're you, and they have full access to, in this case, Office 365. So a large campaign going on, and I believe this is kind of activity is continuing. This getting around multi-factor authentication by proxying a phishing message through a system somewhere in the world that will grab your session token and then go after the multi-factor authentication challenge. So if you're, not paying attention early in the morning, we have seen this work. And then the third breach, right? Source code taken from their GitHub repository. An interesting statement from Okta was that the security of our product and service does not rely on the secrecy of our source code. And I thought that was a powerful statement to make. So we don't know really, when they say source code taken, we don't know if that's the totality of the source code, if that's components of the source code. There's still, in both of these cases, there are a lot of unknowns, because we have to rely on two things: the statements from the companies, and then independent research that's going on. In some cases, like some of the research is from like people on Twitter. In some cases, it's from other cyber companies that have research groups. And so here is the history of what happened with Okta, setting aside that fourth breach that really was more of a third party than them.
Well, Mike,
yeah.
I want to jump in here a little bit about source code breaches specifically.
Yeah.
There's a really interesting aspect of this, which is in theory, and I stress the word theory here. In theory, the source code breach doesn't necessarily expose the company or anybody using that source code, because well written and well executed, there are no secrets in the source code itself. That if you have no flaws, and this is why this is very theoretical. If you have no flaws and your code is perfect and there is nothing available to attack, there's really no attack surface there, the exposure of the source code is not a thing. One of the folks chatting earlier a moment ago was talking about actually it looks like Slack has been breached. That's new news in the last couple of days, and it was a source code breach for Slack. In reality, what that gives an attacker is detailed information about how to find flaws in how you've written something. If there are flaws, it makes it a million times easier for them to find, because it's not a black box anymore. You're not poking at stuff and setting up no-op sleds in something that you've injected in order to see if that works. You look at the code and an attack will work. So that's the surrounding here. When somebody says our security doesn't depend on that, source code secrecy, that's a bold and confident statement.
Mm-hmm.
It may be true, and it's really hard to tell.
Yeah.
And by the way, if you're going to
good point here,
if you're going to avoid all source code that's ever been breached, you need to stop using Windows.
Very true. And so I think that's in both of these cases with the source code, there's a whole lot of, hey, look over there, they may be, cracking your passwords. I think the bigger issues are, number one, as you say, they're reviewing the code to find vulnerabilities that may be exploited later. If there are secrets in the code, I mean, cryptographic secrets, you just gave the farm away. I don't think that stuff is in there. But there is also the potential for a SolarWinds type thing. Maybe we'll talk a little more about that later, right? If they were able to modify the source and convince somebody to install an update that's been backdoored, so that we can, globally get everybody.
Yeah, and I do want to call out, Okta's specific quote here was, our investigation concluded that there was no unauthorized access to the Okta service and no unauthorized access to customer data. Okta does not rely on the confidentiality of its source code for the security of its services. The Okta service remains fully operational and secure. Mike, you pointed out that the LastPass members here, have screenshots that might say something different.
They were all the way in there. I mean, the fact that there was a source code breach later does not preclude that there was one here as well.
And can you remind folks about that SolarWinds type attack and why folks might want to remember that for this?
Yeah, this is the kind of thing that turns into one of these global events, right? When there's a widely used piece of software or some kind of application, and the source code repository, the application itself, can be modified in place prior to updates being pushed out. The updates contain the modified code, which in the case of SolarWinds was a backdoor that gave everybody access, not everybody access, gave the attackers access. And this becomes one of the global meltdowns. And interestingly, we did not have any of those in 2022 the way we did in 2021, but the potential is there. When you're talking about source code being stolen, that's one thing. It's the source code being modified and left in place. That's I think what ends up being the bigger event.
And Fred, how do you see the danger there, or the risk?
Well, I mean, I think it's just what Mike said. There always will remain the possibility that they have injected something into the source code at some point in the process. Whether Okta has determined that that's happened, they should probably let us know if they have signs of that. But if it happens, I think it will happen later. I think they'll inject something into a GitHub repository, which clearly they were able to get into Okta's GitHub repository, and then a couple iterations of the software may go out with some kind of compromise built into it. So I think if that threat will be upcoming, I don't think it's occurred yet.
It also does point out, I think I think there's a slide where we talk about this or ask about this a little more in detail, but since we're talking about source code, if you have version control working for you, and in fact you are archiving your versions elsewhere, other than the primary source, or even if you have just cryptographic signatures for prior versions, you can tell when a change was made.
Yeah, there's this handy tool called diff that's about 150 years old.
Yeah, there's a lot of tools out there, and the way you primarily use those is when one of your developers maybe makes a change that not everybody is happy with, and ferreting that out. But it is absolutely possible in a well-run SDLC to figure out the pattern of changes and what's changed and usually from who.
And I mean, do you think that, based on what happened with SolarWinds, that, now, Okta, and we'll talk about LastPass in a second, is more attuned to that?
I would hope so.
I'm going to jump in and say that the whole world has gotten better. The CI/CD pipelines that people have built a lot of controls and tests and checks within the pipeline that happen in an automated fashion. Now, have they implemented it, across the, everywhere? No, but I would expect Okta or LastPass, leaders in the space, to have a pretty robust tool set monitoring what's going on in their CI/CD pipeline. So I would agree that this is probably a low risk because they're going to have, eyes on glass all the time looking for these kind of changes going forward. And there is a lot of automation in this day and age built into that to detect these kinds of changes that are malicious.
Yeah. And also, Okta is a publicly traded corporation. And so they have shareholder and SEC scrutiny. And so, their controls have to be pretty dang good to avoid, big time penalties, False Claims Act, things like that. So I would think that puts them in a category where they are serious enough to be making sure that unauthorized changes to their code are always detected.
Yeah, and we're going to get to LastPass here.
Yeah, we should.
But I do. Mike Mason puts a good question in the chat here. When reviewing our third party, because it also applies to LastPass, when reviewing our third party vendors' IT controls, we've stepped up the level of scrutiny we give to code controls, things such as preventive controls, acting as separation between developers and production environments. What other things would you be asking vendors who provide software to assess their potential exposure to these kinds of source code risks? What are the red flags?
So I think
go ahead, Fred.
It is that new set of tools that people have been implementing in the CI/CD pipeline. They do automated code review. They're doing different kinds of version checks to make sure things aren't changing in places they shouldn't be changing. There are things where they're actually testing both dynamically and statically the code as it's moving through the pipeline. The question is, have you built these controls? Are you using these tools in your CI/CD pipeline when you're doing this? If you're building in Amazon, it's got a couple free tools that you can use to monitor code in your pipeline. So I think if you're a software shop and this is where you live, you should have a robust suite of tools looking for these kinds of risks.
Right. And the red flags are the fact that those controls are not present, or that they don't understand what you're asking when you ask, right? What are the integrity controls over your source? That's really what the question boils down to, right? Just how do you maintain integrity of source? How can you demonstrate that? And if they can't, and honestly, this needs to be auditable. So, are you audited? Do you have third party come in here and objectively assess this? Because ideally, they're going to be able to give you a piece of paper that's, here's my security papers, make the questioners go away, and those answers should be in there. Any resistance to providing that kind of information, that would be a red flag.
Yep.
There's one that people don't think about all that much too, but I would throw in as important, not as important as what you've already talked about, which are critical, but does the company have a rigorous software testing environment in general? Often when some coder who is not a part of your pipeline, who is not a part of your code base, adds code, they add it in a way that makes something else either act funny or fail or be slower, or something that you can actually catch with just normal testing. So you want to see that they're doing, kind of standard testing regimes with some regression testing, so we know everything still works the way it used to, or that's expected to work like it used to, and so on. So I would add that into the asks: is what does your general software testing regime look like, and is it robust?
Cool. Thanks. All right, let's move on to LastPass. Hamilton.
Okay, so this is interesting. They reported a breach in August, okay? And they said, hey, they got our source. And again, we don't know if this is the entire source code repository, there's parts of it, right? So information is, not complete, and you wouldn't expect it to be, right? There's a lot that companies, when they're going through something like this, they're trying to walk that line between being transparent and not saying something that will get them in trouble with regulators that may not be accurate, right? So they said, okay, they got source code. Then second breach reported December 2022. Yeah, they got our encrypted password vaults. And what they're positioning this as two separate events. And there's plenty of speculation out there that this was one event, and they finally got around to determining that, yes, the encrypted password vaults were taken. I don't know how they have substantiated that this is two different things, and I don't know if it's going to really work out to be two different things. It kind of looks like one thing, especially because they're that close together in time. That's pretty close. So it suggests that this was absolutely one thing. Interestingly, they're talking about if you're using LastPass in a federated way, right? Which means you're using LastPass to activate your identity provider. In the one that they used as an example was Okta. They said you are not affected. Maybe Mike can talk a little more about how exactly that works technically, but I just love absurdities. So Okta gets breached, source code taken. LastPass gets breached, source code taken. Encrypted vault taken. They seemingly have the keys to every kingdom. But if you're using LastPass with Okta, you're okay. That's absurd to me.
Yeah, there's a few things. I mean, I'm not going to go deep dive into Federation. We could spend a 2-hour session on that. But think of it. If you haven't used it before, think of it as if you have an entity that you would like to authenticate yourself to, and that entity and yourself both trusts another party to actually perform the authentication and say, yep, that really is the person that they say it is. Think of that as a sort of a triangular relationship where, and you've all seen this before with possibly log in with Google as an option.
Right.
That is a federation type. That is because in that case, you're not logging into Google. That's already done. You're logging into some other person, a third party, where that third party has said, we trust Google to authenticate users for us. You are actually having an authentication conversation with Google that says, I am who I say I am, whatever level of authentication and authorization you've authorized there. And then what Google is telling the place you're actually log into is yes or no. You can do a lot more than yes or no, and that's where the detail comes in. You can say all kinds of things like yeah, but, and that's where things get fuzzy.
Yeah.
And so, Hamilton, let's move on to the risks related to the LastPass breach. And by the way, I did get somebody emailed me a question that it's worth bringing up, which is, some organizations use LastPass, and some organizations don't know who in their organization is using LastPass, because your users might have bought a personal version of LastPass and then have their password of the organization in there. So, Mike, why don't you go through these?
Well, I'm not going to touch on shadow IT because that's just that's a problem all the time. People using things you don't know about. Don't let them install stuff. But what this boils down to really, and especially in terms of the things you should do now, LastPass goes into a bit of detail in their communications about how if you're going to be okay if you are meeting their recommended standard for master passphrase password for the vault. Okay. And so they're talking about 12 characters. There's a piece that points out that in the beginning they had an 8-character standard, and when they did some upgrades, they never reached out to those original users of the product to say, hey, we're recommending you upgrade from 8 to 12. And so there's still a lot of 8s out there. Setting that aside, this is all about the strength of that master password. If you are using something complex, something long, something that's not easily guessable, you're going to be okay. Can they brute force that? They can. But if you're using something long, complex, etc., it will take longer than a human lifetime to do that, unless it's Chinese quantum computing that maybe or maybe not cracked RSA today. We don't know. So it's all about that master passphrase. So if you were going to do something, jumping ahead, everybody's got to change their master passphrase for sure. That's kind of the low end to do. If the vault is opened, what is with that master passphrase password, what's in it unencrypted is a whole bunch of stuff that can absolutely be used for spear phishing, business email compromise, perpetrating further attacks, right? There's enough information there to really do a lot of knock-on attack. This is not necessarily going to go directly after the organization you work for, but all of that information is certainly useful. There are other things in there. In fact, I think you go to the next slide, Jake. There are things in there that are encrypted as well. When this stuff is all resident inside the vault, and there's parts that are unencrypted and there are parts that are encrypted, what they say is they have used a proprietary binary format to store these things in there. So the words proprietary binary format is code for we hand rolled our own, which is always a bad sign. And again, some of the things that I've seen out in social media, things like that, detail a number of cryptographic sins that were committed by LastPass. I do not know how authoritative those statements are, right? Twitter is not my favorite source for authoritative information.
If you want to jump in on that, though, because LastPass is not claiming that their proprietary binary format is any form of encryption.
Right.
Or that, in fact, it is used to protect your data in any way. So they're not making any claims. The way they've worded it and the way they've explained it, which is accurate, is it might as well be clear text. They're just saying it's not clear text. It's actually just binary.
Yeah, and Dan's putting in. I've seen
are they getting sued already?
Yeah, there's a bunch of lawsuits that I've seen pop up already.
Yeah.
I think one of the things about lawsuits we have to keep in mind is lawsuits are for discovery, so you get to find out a lot of information, and we'll find out a lot as people release that discoverable information. Fred, I know you had thoughts on the password iterations here.
Yeah, well, they made some choices when they were setting it up. Usually it's for computational efficiency. They decided they would go with 100,100 iterations of that running through the algorithm to be enough. If you look at what OWASP, and I mean, if you're building a OWASP compliant application, it should be at least 310. So we're probably close to a third of the number of iterations that would be considered a minimum best practice standards. That's concerning. But what's even more concerning is that older accounts, especially if you've been there with them for 10 years and you've never done anything other than use the tool, you could be down at 500. There's even some settings that we read where they might even be down as low as 1 if you were a very early user of the tool. So they're using less than what we would consider a benchmark standard number of iterations. And if you have an older version of it, it's quite likely you maybe have a significantly at risk set of encrypted data because it did not go through that many iterations.
So Fred, a question here. So if you think that you have a user base that, before they joined your company or whatever, they have their own personal LastPass and they've had it for years and years and years, should you as an IT director or security expert, should you be telling them, hey, if you ever change your LastPass settings, you need to really pay attention to this?
Well, now here's what I'm going to tell them. I'm going to tell them absolutely no company passwords in a personal password vault, full stop. That has to be the recommendation, and it has to be under a LastPass or whatever password manager you're using should be essentially managed, at least from an account management perspective. Obviously, you can do individual settings at the user level, but do not store company passwords in a personal vault. Full stop. You lose the password to that, and those passwords are gone. Right? You forget that.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I think it's worthwhile also explaining what these iterations do.
Yeah, this is an algorithm that's useful for what do they call it, Mike? Password stretching.
Yeah, it's essentially about making it computationally expensive, to use the correct term, to iterate against that password. Iterate passwords against the password vault. So if you think that the password might be password 123, you can't just launch password 123 against the vault that you're looking for. You actually have to go through this many iterations, however many it is, 310,000, 5,001, or 100,100 iterations of their hashing function, of that hashing function selected. We actually named the hashing function a couple of slides further. Mm-hmm. You have to do that many times against that guess before you can try to apply it to the actual vault. The theory being that if you make, if that's really expensive, if you have to do this 310,000 times every time you want to make a new guess,
takes forever.
Takes a long time. Well, not quite forever, but pretty damn close.
Yeah,
close enough.
Functionally forever.
Yeah. So that's. I just want everybody to kind of understand why those numbers are important.
Hey,
yeah.
and by the way,
question about salt up here that I want to.
Yeah, go ahead.
I don't know. Can somebody verify that they were using a username as the salt in there, because that's what they add to this algorithm. They salted along the way as well.
So I'm going to say they're not going to tell people that. We're going to find out because the source code's out there eventually. But they're not going to give away everything they're doing. Basically, describe how you can attack their algorithm. At least I wouldn't be doing that if I was.
They have not published that to my knowledge.
Yeah, and hey, an important question from Hector here. What if that vault was protected with MFA prior to the breach? Are you okay then?
Nope.
Because the MFA applies to, you're logging into basically to their web site, right? And there's some interesting interplay there, whether you're interacting with while you're interacting with the cloud vault, sometimes it pivots back to their website and then passes your hashed token, which can be grabbed. So there's some nuance there, but the answer is functionally no.
Well, yeah, once they have the password vaults in hand, you bypass the step where multi-factor authentication comes in. So that's completely out of the equation once the password vaults are stolen.
A really great question, though, and in fact, I think a lot of folks would be excused for thinking that was sufficient, and that was protecting this particular breach. I'm glad you asked that, because it's a critical piece of this.
So here, and let me hit the next slide here. we had a lot of conversation around this one internally. Fred, you want to take this one?
Sure. So they're using an algorithm which is somewhat obscure. We're all familiar with AES and RSA, which, if you read the paper, might have been cracked by quantum computing in China today. So that's a whole new story into itself. But they're using a particular cipher that can be used in a number of ways. It can be used to hash the passwords. It can also be used as a stream cipher. So it may be encrypting things as it's being fed data. We don't know exactly how they're using this, but what we do know is the source code is out there and the bad guys are going to be looking at it. And the one thing that we talked about before, it is a really poor practice to go and build your own crypto implementation. If you want to look back to somebody who stepped on their own foot, Zoom, right at the beginning of the pandemic, if you remembered, they had to completely rebuild, bring an emergency crypto team in, one completely outside the company, because their internal folks messed it up terribly, frankly, and rebuild their encryption from the ground up. This is considered one of the riskiest things you can do, is design, build, and implement your own crypto system. It's really scary now that the source code's out there, because now they have the ability. That's the one place I think they have the ability to go find out, have they been implementing the entropy component of it wrong? A very common place. If you're building Microsoft encryption with their crypto kit, people blow this all the time. So what we're going to find out is how well did they implement their crypto algorithm, because people are going to be trying to break it.
Yeah, I mean, as an example, I always use Brownian motion in a cup of tea as my entropy function. I mean, that is the standard. Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy people appreciate that one. I do want to say though that we use it in the industry as an absolute. Don't write your own crypto. And yes, for 99.999% of people, that's an absolute. Yeah, that's a sin. But if nobody writes crypto, then nobody has crypto. So it's a little bit of a sliding scale. If you just write software and you are not, and it's not about security, yeah, don't even think about it. I would say that in LastPass's case, you could theoretically make a case that because their entire business model is about their crypto, that they can hire some of the best in the world and really, really do a great job of that. And maybe that's okay. I'm not saying it is, but you can't really make it an absolute when the company itself is focused on crypto. Like, should RSA write their own crypto, or should they somehow farm that out? Obviously, they write their own. So it's good to have this discussion. It's good to the bar should be, unless you have an incredibly good reason, do not write your own. And do not use Brownian motion in a cup of tea as your randomization.
Yep.
Some good questions coming in.
Yeah, there are good questions here. Let me hit the next slide, and then I'm going to go. Oops, sorry. Itchy trigger finger there. Let's go to things we don't know, and then I'm going to go to some of the questions in the chat. Hamilton, you want to take this one?
I think we touched on a lot of these as we were going. Right? Can the source code be used to determine how to recover cryptographic materials? Right? Are there secrets in the code? Are there flaws that can be determined there? I still think it's an interesting question as to whether or not source and vault info were taken at the same time from LastPass. I think that has bearing on not only their quality of communication and transparency, but their internal controls and their ability to detect does not seem exemplary to me. That's what I take away from that. Their ability to detect what's going on in their network and go, oh, the source code has been taken, but somehow it took them a long time to figure out, oh, the vaults were it too. I'm just not buying the fact that was two separate things. Can the source be used to identify vulnerabilities? Yep, there are people going through the code right now. And if there is a vulnerability in there that can be exploited in some way, it may show up. The SolarWinds thing is always in the back of everybody's mind, right? Integrity of the code is a big deal. I mean, that's what GitHub is for, really. Vulnerable components that may be exploited, to me, this is This goes to the use of any open source components in there that they do not manage. That's left to somebody else to manage. And we've read a lot about open source being compromised in the wild and then implemented in all kinds of products. Mike, I know you've got, you think it's bigger than that. It's any component, but I'm especially concerned about any use of open source. And then ask yourself, really, I mean, if there's 20 million customers that are using LastPass, are you so important that they're going to whip out, the GPUs to go to work on you? Because if so, I don't see Morgan Stanley on this call. I don't see, agencies of the U.S. government on this call. And I think in terms of prioritization, that's who it would be. You got to ask yourself too, was this purely criminal, or is there nation state fingerprints here that may be using this kind of thing for espionage more than for, financial gain? Because we don't know that yet either. I mean, we know about the LastPass gang, and they were, originally in there. But the fact of the matter is, this is hugely valuable information for the Chinas, the Russias, the Irans of the world to be going through to learn how they can use this. And in the back of my mind, I'm always thinking nation state signal is got to be part of this.
So I want to jump in. I'd love to jump in. I think we would all argue about who's at risk here. I think it's a little more, they will use a more mechanical approach. They're going to run algorithms to look for people that have access to things that they may want. I think it could be anybody, because what they will then do next is run a bunch of rainbow table attacks to find all the easy, quick ones. And with some automation, they could probably run through those 20 million vaults and find all the weak ones within a week. So I think it's much more dangerous than people are thinking. When you say, am I a target? You're a target if you have a weak password, because I think they can run through those. They can determine which ones have weak passwords, and they will attempt to crack those and attack those people. That's my statement.
There's a question. Brandon in the chat actually asked a question I think I'd like to have everybody talk about here. So I'll read.
Yeah.
I don't want to read the whole thing necessarily, but what is the overall opinion of using services like LastPass for password management? He goes on to kind of a discussion that he's had with folks about this. So basically, he's heard people saying, "Oh, it's a bad idea. You shouldn't use these kinds of services."
Well, you should use these kinds of services. Fred made a good point early on when we just all found out about this. And it's like, okay, well, what should everybody do? And Fred pointed out, the Microsofts, the Googles of the world offer this service. And out of all of these vendors, who do you trust more in terms of their internal controls, the quality of their coding and their cryptographic standards that are met, things like that? And that's kind of a good point. Why not leave it up to Google? Because I think what we are seeing here is that the product is solid. The internal controls for these businesses are what has failed, for lack of a better term.
Yeah. So, but let me jump to this though, because on this slide, so a couple of things people need to do: change all of your LastPass Master Vault passwords, change your passwords and API keys, and should you change your password vault products? This gets to Tammy's question: are we better running password keepers on premise instead of the cloud? And if you're not going to use LastPass, how do you decide what else to do? People in the chat have asked about Dashlane. They've asked about 1Password. Somebody else asked about Keeper. What should people do? Mike Simon, can you take this? Because I know
hang on. That was going to be my point, right?
Oh, okay. Go ahead. Yeah,
everybody eventually is going to get smacked. Everybody, right? This is a foreseeable event. You can have the best preventive controls in the world, and someone can be bribed to throw in a USB stick or something like that. So, it becomes 6 of one, 2 pie of the other. And who is it you're going to trust? And I think Fred's point about, the Googles, the Microsofts of the world, probably having the best internal controls might be the way to go.
I agree with that. I will say that running it yourself, like that was part of that question, was should I just run it internally? That's a great idea if you can spend the kind of money and build the level of service and controls that these cloud-based service folks can. There's a good chance running it internally, that you cannot spend the kind of resources they are to try to protect this. You're not going to be as targeted, so the likelihood is lower, blah blah blah. But if you do get, if that server you're running it on gets owned, the administrative account gets owned in some way, and in fact that administrative account, for whatever you've built, that administrative account actually has access to the secrets, you're not in any better shape.
Yeah.
I see the long-term solution popping up in some of the comments, like moving to passkeys or some FIDO2 system that then starts removing this problem from the equation. In particular, passkeys would be removing this from the equation. So really, we're at the cusp of probably yet another change. I mean, Mike and I have been using, and I think Mike Simon broke out one of his old crypto cards from 20 years ago. I pulled out one that I have from VeriSign that's still working. Doug Barbin, who's on this call, he probably has one.
Probably has one too.
Yep. And so it's time to take the next step, folks. We're getting pushed into a corner with passwords. It's time to start looking to something more robust.
Yeah.
There's a really important thing to point out here too, which is somebody asked earlier, did 2FA, if you had 2FA for your LastPass account, did that protect you? The answer is no. No, based on what's happened here. But if you have 2FA associated with the accounts whose passwords you were storing in LastPass, you actually can be a little more relaxed. I wouldn't relax. I would go ahead and change everything. But that all that got exposed in the LastPass breach, if in fact they're able to guess your master password and get access to your vault, those accounts in your vault that also have 2FA are still protected by 2FA. They don't have access to your token or the application you're using or your cell phone, hopefully, although your cell phone number is very likely listed with the breach, by the way. So that is a layer of protection that's available here. And probably most of you have that associated with those things that are those accounts that were in your LastPass if you're using it.
Yeah, I want to point out one thing that is not extant on this slide as we go into this. We talked a lot about how this technique of going in through the third party, using the fourth party to get to the third party to get to you. This is something where you should worry not only about you should take action, risk-based action for your own organization, but you should be talking to your service providers. Do you use LastPass? What are you doing? Because if they get popped, they could be coming for you. And that could be the route that we should maybe be most concerned about, right? Looking for that, kind of open window that they're going to crawl in through on their way to you.
And go ahead, Mike, finish your thought.
Well, you should definitely change LastPass master vault passwords right now. That is the one thing that you can do that will insulate you the most and the fastest from somebody coming after you and trying to crack your vault, and if your users had poorly chosen passwords, right? Definitely go out there and set a standard for your own organization and make everybody do it. Go ahead, Fred.
I'd like to address the last change your password vault products. Here's the number one reason I believe you need to change your product. If, in fact, a breach does happen in the future because of LastPass, you will be held negligible because you've been
negligent.
Forewarned. Negligent. You'll be held negligent because you have not made the move on something that is already being basically warning you that there could be trouble. So just this existential threat that if something were to happen and I was still on LastPass, that would be very difficult to explain away. And that's a really poor situation for LastPass customers to be in, and it's a bad situation for LastPass if we're unlucky like so many of us will be. But that's a fact, right? There is a risk if you stay with this that you may be considered negligent by not switching.
So and to that point, look, there's no one out there who can say I will never be breached, right? Like that's so not a thing. One of the things we said we'd talk about is what can you do? Like, what can you do as an organization that and make some assumptions about your vendors being breached, you having a breach. You have to be able to prepare for an attack detect an attack and respond quickly. If you so Fred and Mike Simon, in terms of detection, so let's just say that a bunch of organizations do get breached through the LastPass breach. If you have either an internal or an outsourced SOC, what should you be counting on those SOCs for? What should they be looking for in your environment?
That's a great question, and in fact, I've got some answers. But then I've got my evil Mike mind going here, where you could also defeat that. The obvious thing is anomalous login activity regarding location, regarding behavior, regarding time zone. So your workforce, the people you have logging into things, likely have patterns, and those patterns establish. One of the easiest things for me to find is actually when attackers are in a specific country with specific time zones, because they always attack during work hours during that country. For work hours for whatever that is. Now, you can reply that in reverse. You say, my users log in from 6 o'clock a.m. to maybe 8 or 10 o'clock in the evening, and so on and so forth. This user usually logs in from Kenmore, Washington, and so on and so forth. You need that baseline. You need that activity, and you need people watching for variations in that activity. I will say that the machine learning algorithms for most providers, like big ones like Microsoft, actually do watch for that and do alerting, but the alerting is in the data stream that you may not be watching unless you're logging into the portal and putting your own eyeballs on glass for the portal. We do that in a different way by acquiring the data directly. But the key is for looking for that. Now, putting my evil Mike hat on for a moment, with the level of detail that I might have available to me about these accounts now and their phone numbers and so on, and the IP addresses that they've been logging in from, if I'm a focused attacker with some competence, I can fake all of that as well.
Essentially, you're dealing with compromised credentials. It's the risk is not very different from when somebody's had their credentials phished, right? Somebody's got credentials that can do what they want. So you need to do the identical things, right? Yeah. As Mike said, UEBA is probably your best friend here, looking for signs of, malicious activity, beaconing and, Cobalt Strike launching Mimikatz and exfiltration of large amounts of all the same things are going to be the triggers you're going to look for, because that's what it is. It's a compromised credential. That's what we're talking about here.
Yeah.
And can folks do that on, can you do that on your own? Should you get an outsourced SOC to do it? How do you, and also, do you need to, build a new IR plan based on this, Fred?
Well,
playbook. Yeah.
Look, I think you need 24/7 monitoring. I don't care what situation you're in. I think that's just table stakes at this point. So whether you're doing it yourself or outsourcing it, again, you need to have the resources to do it. If you want to bring it in-house, you can't do it on the back of one person or maybe two people. This is something that's probably a 24/7 operation. So it's the same situation, right? You got to have eyes on what's going on, or you're driving blind. And nobody wants to be driving 55 miles down the freeway with a blindfold on.
Yeah,
so
and Zscaler did publish their playbook for it was specifically for Okta.
Yeah.
And that might be a good thing to review.
Yeah, they had a real nice set of detections to take a look at and see if, in fact, some of these identity components are being misused or compromised. So that was really useful kind of community thing that they did for everybody.
Yeah.
I think one key here, though, too, is to make sure that your assumptions are that systems like this can be breached, that they can be compromised in a way that you will have to react and deal. So it's one thing to say that, and it's one thing to say that your incident response plan should include, being able to change all your passwords and that kind of stuff. Until you've practiced it, it doesn't exist. And if you have not taken your IR plan for something like this and said, okay, folks, I know this is a pain in the neck and we're just going to do it. you don't have a working plan. You have an idea that you hopefully should be able to execute against. So,
and you should have a playbook for successful phishing attacks for sure, because you're going to see that probably more than maybe any other attack you're going to be dealing with. If you don't have a playbook for that, you should get one.
Great. So we're going to go to last thoughts here in a second. Just going back to what I said, folks need to be able to prepare for an attack, like you just said, Mike Simon. If you haven't tested your IR plan with a tabletop exercise, why even have it? You have to be able to detect an attack quickly, and you have to be able to respond rapidly. Here's the Q&A slide, which is where we were supposed to do Q&A, but we've just been doing it throughout.
Yeah.
So I do want to do final thoughts, but before I do, and if folks want to get in touch with us, one of our colleagues, Ellie, is happy to route any conversations. If you want to have a sit down with Fred or Mike Simon or Mike Hamilton to have questions, email Ellie, and she can set that up for you. But Fred, before we go to final thoughts, there is a question that came up in the chat, which was what you were saying before. Are you saying if anybody's had a breach, you shouldn't do business with them? I don't think that's what you're saying.
No, I'm saying that this is an identity provider who has had multiple published breaches in a row. There's clearly the implication that some of their internal security processes are not as robust as they should be. So there is I think if you sit yourself in the witness chair and somebody says, why did you stay with LastPass when they had 4 breaches in 2023? You know that it was possible to compromise these vaults if they had a weak password. Why did you stay with this vendor? Yeah, I might be able to talk my way out of that, but I don't want to be in that position ever where I have to make that explanation. So to me, I look at it as, it's a risk management thing, and it's sad that this is the way you may have to approach this, but that's how I view that.
Good. All right. We'll do final thoughts here in 1 second. My colleague Ginny is going to put a survey in the chat. We really do appreciate when people take the survey. A couple things about the survey. Number one, we like to know how we're doing this. Number two, gives you a way to get in touch with us. And number three, this year we are making donations to the Society for Information Management for everybody who fills out the survey. They're a great organization. A bunch of our customers are actually members of them in the Seattle area, but great organization that educates it educates information managers around the country. Okay, Mike, final thoughts.
Which Mike are you talking to?
Oh, you started talking.
So if you're going to go through a replacement project, look at all of the attributes that could potentially apply to you, the things that you need. What do you need this to integrate with? What internal controls do you want demonstrated from that provider, blah, 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 and do this objectively as possible. They're probably going to get whacked too, and just keep that in the back of your mind. But I think the bigger thing is to go out and talk to the third parties that have maybe extraordinary access into your organization. Find out what they are doing. I'd be tracking those third parties as much as you are working with your own organization.
Excellent. Mike Simon, final thoughts.
I think each time this kind of thing happens, we learn a little bit about how to more deeply prepare ourselves. With Log4j a while back, we learned that, hey, you know what? We need a really, really deep dive inventory into every piece of software we use. And if you don't have that, you're going to have to do it, scramble on the fly to figure out if it's buried somewhere deep in your infrastructure, and that's not a good time to do it. That was a learning moment. In this case, I believe the learning is that essentially the ability to react to a breach at this level. What does it look like, and have you practiced it?
Yep. And by the way, if folks want help with that, building an IR plan or practicing it, that's something we can help with. Just shoot Ellie an email there. She's her name's up there. All right, Fred, final thought.
So never let a good breach go to waste. So this is a good opportunity to go out and understand what you want to be in the future, especially with the world slowly starting to move to a zero trust environment. Authentication being the key component, or one of the key components of a zero trust architecture. Start thinking about where you want to be in 5 years. Maybe you don't have to move today, but start planning now, whether you're going to be passkeys, tokens, hard tokens. Where do you want to be in 5 years? This is the time to start thinking about that now.
Awesome. All right. Well, everybody, thank you for joining us. We're at the top of the hour here. So I want to thank everyone for joining us. If you had a question that you put in the chat and we didn't get to it, email it to me, jake@criticalinsight.com, and I'll make sure you get an answer to it. Everyone else, everybody, Happy New Year. We'd appreciate if you took that survey, and we look forward to talking to you in more events this year. Have a great day, everybody. Thanks for joining. Bye-bye.
Happy New
Bye,
Year.
everybody. Thanks for coming.
Thanks, everyone.